Forged by Bart D. Ehrman. Book review. The subtitle is Writing in the Name of God: Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. Now, this is part of what I've been calling my scripted review series, in which I take a review that I actually wrote years ago on my weblog and try to use that written review as the basis for a video review. Before I get into this, though, I need to talk about my history on this topic because it's going to inform how I reacted to the book. So, those of you who have been watching this channel and maybe heard this story before will just have to bear with me here. I've told this story a number of times on this channel before, but the story basically is the shock I got as a young Christian conservative entering into a Christian college and learning for the first time what the scholarship was behind the Bible. So I grew up in the Calvinist enclave of the Dutch Calvinist enclave of West Michigan. I went through the Calvinist Christian schools, Ada Christian Elementary, Ada Christian Middle School, Grand Rapids Christian High School, and then that all fed into what was known at the time as Calvin College. I think changed its name to Calvin University. If you're not familiar with these institutions, you can Google them or you can just take my word for it. They're conservative Christian Calvinist institutions. They're not known for being bastions of liberalism. But at Calvin College, a conservative Christian college, we were required to take some religion courses because it's a Christian college. And in Religion 101, we got a very brief overview to biblical scholarship. And like many conservative Christians who get exposed to this stuff for the first time, it surprised me a lot. So among other things, in the New Testament, the professor told us that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they told us that the epistles of 1st and 2nd Peter were not actually written by Peter. And they told us that in Paul's letters, there were at least 3 of Paul's letters, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, which were not written by Paul. They were written by somebody else who was just using Paul's name on the letters. And this made a big impression on me because it was completely different than everything I had learned up until that point in my years of going to private Christian schools and in my years of Sunday school and church attendance and stuff like that. Nobody had ever told me this. And if it had been coming from an atheist or, from an outsider or something like that, of course I would have put up my guard and I would have been skeptical. But it wasn't. It was coming from the religion professor at a conservative Christian college who was telling us for the first time what the scholarship was. Now, over the years, as a lot of young conservative Christians do, I've since moved into becoming a skeptic and currently consider myself an agnostic. And the reasons behind that journey are many. And I'm not going to get into all of that here, but one part of it was certainly what I learned about biblical scholarship. Opened my eyes to maybe the Bible wasn't all that I maybe had thought it was when I was younger. And I've actually used that point before myself when I'm talking about theology with people in bars or, when I'm talking at a coffee house and pointed out to people that, the stuff you learned in Sunday school was completely wrong. Turned out Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't even written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Turns out some of Paul's letters weren't even written by Paul. And quite often use that point myself. But never really dived into biblical scholarship. I never really felt much of a need to do that until I got curious and I started checking some stuff out. If you've been following this channel, maybe you've seen these reviews. a book called The Unauthorized Version, Truth and Fiction in the Bible by a classical scholar, Robin Lane Fox. Talks about the stuff that's true and the stuff that's not true in the Bible. And the Yale lecture series, which are freely available on YouTube, also as audio downloads. The one on the Old Testament by Christine Hayes and the one on the New Testament by Dale Martin. So both of those sources, the Yale lectures and the book by Robin Lane Fox, got into a little bit why it is that scholars don't believe that 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are written by Paul. Just to recap that briefly, Dale Martin in his lectures bases most of his argument on stylistic concerns. The fact that 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are written in this elaborate Greek rhetorical language. I believe he talks about how it was considered good writing at that time in ancient Greece to embed a bunch of subclauses into sentences. And after demonstrating, he says, Paul could do this, but Paul doesn't do this. If we look at Paul's other letters, he doesn't use this rhetorical style. So Dale Martin says that's why scholars say that these letters couldn't possibly have been written by Paul. Robin Lane Fox actually takes the opposite take in his book. Robin Lane Fox says, yes, the style is different, but Robin Lane Fox says, but be careful, because styles can change. Or, maybe Paul just wanted to write in a different style. Or, the same person can be capable of two different styles, or their style of writing could change over time. So Robin Lane Fox says we need to look at other criteria, but by judging other criteria, he says that, again, he comes to the same conclusion. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are actually not written by Paul. And his reasoning is it assumes a church structure where there was kind of one person in charge of the church, which was not true in Paul's day. And the theological issues and the theological enemies that the book addresses are actually part of the 2nd century concerns. It was concerned with the things that would have been an issue in the 2nd century Christian church, but not the 1st century church. So I found both of those arguments interesting, but those were just very brief arguments. And it's a funny thing. If you ever, I don't know if you've ever had this, where you get a little bit into something, and then you think to yourself, why haven't I ever been curious about this before? I mean, here I was. I've been using this information that I got from my university professors for years when discussing theology with people, about how there were forgeries in the Bible, and 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus weren't actually written by Paul. And up until I had relatively recently gotten into this material, I had really never bothered or never been curious to find out for myself, why do scholars think that 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are forgeries, or are not written by Paul? I all these years I've just been going, well, it's what my college professor said. My college professor told me, but not really looking into the reasons behind it myself. So I decided that this is something I needed to remedy, and I got a little taste of it with Dale Martin and with Robin Lane Fox. But I was home back in America. I was teaching English in Cambodia at the time, but was home on the holidays, and was in the religion section, curious maybe to brush up on my biblical scholarship and make up for lost time. And I saw this book by Bart Ehrman. Now, at the time, actually, this was the first Bart Ehrman book I ever read. I knew who he was because he'd been making waves in Christian circles and skeptic circles with his book Misquoting Jesus and Jesus Interrupted. His books. But I hadn't bothered to get into them at the time. So I was browsing the shelves and I saw this book, Forged, Writing in the Name of God: Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are, by Bart Ehrman. It was actually the only book by Bart Ehrman on the shelves at my bookstore, because I think this was at the time the newest book. This book came out in 2011. I was back home for Christmas in 2012, but this was the new Bart Ehrman book that I got my that was in the bookstores at the time. So I thought to myself, perfect. I'd been wanting to get more into the theory of why we know that the Bible wasn't actually written by its traditional authors. And here's a whole book on it on the shelves. So I picked it up and I bought it. Yeah. Okay, so a few things maybe to say about this. I've been using the word forged a little bit, which is the name of the book. Forged is a loaded term. It has negative connotations. These are negative connotations that Christian scholars avoid. And again, going back to my own experience learning this stuff in Calvin College, my professor, after telling us that 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus were not written by Paul, but somebody pretending to be Paul, made a big point of saying, now I don't want you to think that there's anything wrong with this. This was not somebody attempting to be duplicitous. This was just something very common that was happening in the first century, where people, when they wrote theological treatises, would write them in the name of the master of their theological school. So anyone who considered themselves writing in the Pauline school of theology would just sign Paul's name to it. And it was not duplicitous. Everybody knew that it was a common practice to do this. And sorry, lost my train of thought. It was even a sign of being humble. Like, you're not saying, well, this isn't my ideas. I've just been influenced by the St. Paul, so I'm going to give him the credit for the ideas as a way of deflecting your own ego or something like that. So that's what I had learned at the Christian college. Robin Lane Fox disagrees with that. He says no, it was blatant lying when the author of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus tried to pretend he was Paul. Bart Ehrman gets even more into this. He's got 2 whole chapters in his book, chapter 1 and 4, I believe it was. Yeah, where he goes to great lengths to say, no, this was not commonly accepted practice in the ancient world. The ancients knew about the practice of forgery. It was a big problem in the ancient world where people were writing stuff under different people's names. And it was not looked upon kindly. People thought it was awful at the time. People thought it was forgery at the time, just like we would nowadays. The motivation for writing stuff under somebody else's name is if you have theological views that you want to advance, and you want to give these views more authority by attaching them to somebody's name. So imagine you're a Christian in the 2nd century. You're in the middle of a theological dispute. You want your views to be validated above the views of the other Christians. So you all of a sudden produce these books and you're like, well, this isn't me saying this. This is St. Paul who said this. I have his books right here. And that would be the motivation for producing those books. At least that's what Bart Ehrman says. I mean, I guess you can decide for yourself which argument you find more convincing. But Bart Ehrman has, again, like I said, 2 whole chapters in which he tries to demonstrate through examples of how of what we know about the ancient world, and examples of what happened when the ancients themselves were aware of other forgeries, how they reacted to it. And then Bart Ehrman goes off for most of the book to talk about other Christian forgeries which didn't make it into the Bible. Now, this is my biggest criticism of the book, is that the book is titled, or the book is subtitled, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. That's the subtitle of this book. And I, like I said, I bought this book thinking that this would give me insight into why scholars think that the Paul didn't write 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. But then what the book actually is, once you've bought it, once you get it home and once you start reading it, is most of the book is talking about non-canonical literature that was written in the author's name. Sorry, that was written in the apostle's name. So he talks about the Gospel of Peter, which is a gospel written as if Peter had written it, and the Apocalypse of Peter. And he talks about an epistle of Peter, not the epistles of Peter that are in our Bible, but a non-canonical epistle of Peter. All of this was written as if Peter had wrote it, but Peter didn't write it. Now, this is something, he's deliberately starting with the low-hanging fruit, because this is something that both skeptical scholars and Christians actually agree with. So, if you say to a Christian, do you believe that St. Peter actually wrote the non-canonical Gospel of Peter? They'd say, like, no, that's an apocryphal document that wasn't inspired by God. Peter didn't write it. All the documents by the apostles are in the Bible. So even a Christian would agree that the Gospel of Peter was a forgery. So by going through all these forgeries from the early church, which are attributed to all these different apostles or early church figures, Bart Ehrman is demonstrating that, he's saying, see, this material is out there. So you can't argue that you can't argue that forgery wasn't taking place in the early Christian church. And you can't argue that the Christians approved of this, because when they denounced these as false gospels, false teachings, forgeries. So you can't say it was just an accepted practice. So there is definitely, it is definitely a link in the chain of arguments he wants to make. But he does not need to go into the amount of detail that he does. He just kind of goes through one apocryphal gospel after another, summarizing it, giving its history, saying what the church leaders thought of it. And by the time you get done with the whole book, it's really it's not about the Bible, at least not majorly. It's like a survey of apocryphal literature. Should have been the book's title. Forged, a survey of apocryphal literature. It would have been a more accurate title than what it was. Now, he does get into the actual Bible eventually, but it's only 50 pages out of the whole book, and they are an interesting 50 pages once you do get to them. But if you see this book on Amazon, or if you see this book on the bookshelves at your bookstore, just be warned. Out of that whole book, there's really only a good 50 pages. Now, as I mentioned before, I had some exposure to the scholarship with why scholars, even Christian scholars, thought that these books weren't written by Paul. Some from Robin Lane Fox, some from Dale Martin. And I was hoping to get into the more nitty-gritty details, but Bart Ehrman resists doing this. He says in his book, an incredible amount of scholarship has been devoted to the pastoral letters. The pastoral letters is the scholarly name for 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. The reason they're called pastoral letters is because they're the only letters of Paul which are written to the pastor of a congregation. as opposed to just the whole congregation, right? Like when Paul wrote Galatians, it was just to the whole Galatian church. First and Second Timothy and Titus are written to specifically Timothy and Titus, so they're written to the pastors, so they're called the pastoral letters. Sorry, that was a digression. Back to the quotation. He says an incredible amount of scholarship has been devoted to the pastoral letters just in the past 30 years. Much of it is tedious to normal human beings, but fascinating to those of us who are abnormal scholars. I can't summarize it all here. Instead, I simply give a few reasons for thinking that all three letters were written by the same person and that this person was not Paul. And I read that and I'm like, oh, I actually wanted to get into the nitty-gritty details. That being said, though, I don't speak ancient Greek. I've not learned to read ancient Greek. So to the extent that a lot of these technical details rely on understanding of the ancient Greek words themselves, I don't know. I don't know if it would be possible to write a book for the layperson who doesn't know ancient Greek, in which you get into all these details. I kind of hope maybe it would be, and maybe that book would be out there someday. But Bart Ehrman is not even going to try. He's just going to say, he says, we're just going to, all the scholarship of the past 30 years, it's just boring. You wouldn't be interested in it. And then he gets to page 114 a little bit later. This is at the end of his section. And he said, there are plenty more reasons, but the arguments can get a bit dull after a while. So he does skip over it. That being said, the 50 pages that he does devote to it are interesting. It's 50 pages out of 265 total, but it does get interesting. Then he gets around to the Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Which again, scholars, even Christian scholars, don't think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And he just more or less skips over it. He says, I argue this case in my book, Jesus Interrupted, and probably don't need to give all the arguments and information yet again here. And I was like, oh, but I didn't buy Jesus Interrupted. I bought this book. And this book was titled, Why the Bible's Authors Are Not Who We Think They Are. So don't tell me, oh, it's just all my other book. It frustrated me. And at the time I got this book, I hadn't yet read Jesus Interrupted, which it turns out was my mistake. Bart Ehrman is kind of assuming that because Jesus Interrupted was one of his best-selling books, I think, that you've read Jesus Interrupted first. That's not clear until you get into the book, so you'd never know it if you were just buying it off the bookshelves, which I was. But whatever. He does get into it a little bit, and he does have some interesting arguments. Yeah, so other things to talk about. Basically the whole Bible, the whole New Testament. Bart Ehrman is a New Testament scholar, so his book is only about the New Testament. Almost none of the books are by who you think they are. So 1st and 2nd Peter are not written by Peter. James was not written by James. Jude was not written by Jude, etc. There's one exception, one category of exception, is that there actually was a historical Paul, and scholars of the Bible, both skeptic and religious, believe that seven of the books in the Bible are actually by Paul. I can't list the 7 off the top of my head, but there are 13 books in the Bible attributed to Paul. Scholars, both Christians and skeptics, believe that 7 of them were written by Paul. Of the remaining 6, 3 of them were definitely not written by Paul, and these are the 3 I've already been talking about: 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And again, they don't teach you this in Sunday school, but this is something that is believed by both Christian and skeptics, scholars, by both Christian scholars and skeptic scholars. And that's 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. And then there are 3 books that are in dispute, which some people argue are by Paul and which some people argue are not by Paul. And these are Colossians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians. And my understanding is that they are indeed in dispute, and are still in dispute. This is maybe another small criticism I have with this book, Bart Ehrman tends to lump all 6 of these books into books that we definitely know are forged. He briefly acknowledges that there's some resistance about Colossians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians, but then for the rest of the book, he just treats them all as being accepted forgeries. So if this book was your only insight into the controversy, you would I think walk away from this book thinking that it was decided that Colossians, Ephesians, and 2nd Thessalonians were not written by the Apostle Paul, whereupon in actuality those books are still in dispute. What else do I have to say about this book? Getting into more minor complaints, the endnotes in this book drove me a little bit crazy. I complain about endnotes a lot. I just hate doing it because you're reading along and then you come to a number 3 and you're like, okay, should I flip to the back and check that, or should I just keep reading? And you think, don't want to take a risk. Maybe there's important information, and so then you flip to the back to check it, and half the time there is actually important information buried in the endnote. It's Bart Ehrman expanding on the argument he was making in the main text with something that's important or interesting to know, and half the time it's just a reference. And then when you flip and it's just a reference, you're like, wasted my time flipping back. I complain about this with every book I read, but I really wish that the endnotes, the ones that contain actual information that the reader should know, would actually be put at the bottom of the page so you don't have to keep flipping to the back. And if it's just a citation, then you can put that in the back, but I really hate it when the citations are mixed up with the useful information. What else to say about this? I think that there's a couple more things I've put in my written review, but I think I'm just going to call this good. That's basically most of the points I wanted to make. So, in summary, there's an interesting 50 pages in this book, but those 50 pages are buried in a survey of non-canonical biblical literature, which I felt like was a little bit of a bait and switch by either the author or the publisher. I felt like what the book advertised itself as being was not actually what it was when you got it home and actually started reading it. That being said, I did learn some interesting things from it. And Bart Ehrman can definitely write well, so it wasn't terrible. I definitely kept me turning the pages and held my interest till the end, but I was frustrated by how little of the book's content actually dealt with what I wanted it to deal with. I'll finish here.